Hello everybody, my name is Adrian Whitfield and I want to give you an update on the new Simulink connector for 2023. For the 2023 release, we added support for Simulink Test. So this means that you can now author test cases inside of Polarion and import these into Simulink Test. So we'll do a quick demo and show how this functionality works. So right now we have a requirement specification that's been imported into Polarion, linked to some blocks, and then we've created backlinks inside of Polarion for those blocks as surrogates, and then those surrogates are linked to the requirements back inside of Polarion. So what I can do now is I can switch to our test case specification. We've called it high level cruise control test case specification. If I scroll down in the document, you can see that we have a number of high level test cases that we've created. You'll notice that there's some new buttons now available in the requirements toolbox in Simulink test mode. And all we need to do to import these is to click on the Import to Simulink Test Manager. And what we'll do is we'll take these test cases and we'll create those tests inside of Simulink Test. So you can see Simulink Test launches now, and you can see the document name. I'll just kind of make that pane a bit bigger. Name of the document. And if I expand all, you can see that the hierarchy of the document is maintained. The headings inside of the document are test suites inside of Simulink Test, and then you can actually see the actual test cases that have come over. Now, some of these test cases already have links to requirements. So if I select, for instance, CC590, you can see that it verifies this requirement. So if I switch back to Simulink Test and look at CC590, for instance, and then look under Simulink Test, you can see that that requirement relationship also now exists. So the connector automatically created those requirements links to test cases and vice versa. You can, of course, modify the document and re-import it, and the changes will be reflected in Simulink Test. You can delete test cases as well. You can also work with revisions of test case documents, but only one revision can exist at any one time in Simulink Test. So you could switch from a head revision like we are today back to an earlier revision, or you could have an earlier revision and switch to the head, or a later revision even as well. You can also work at the project level in Polarion as well, where you're at the tracker view and you've got your test cases, for instance, in the tracker view. You can import those as well, and it would come over as a sort of flat list. And you can also change the behavior even when you're working with the documents. You can choose to ignore the headings and just import the test cases, or you can convert headings to test cases. There's all sorts of different possibilities, and you'll need to check the documentation to do all of those things. Anyway, once the test cases are over in Simulink Test, and by the way, the descriptions of course come over as well, you may decide then to do one or two things. You could further refine these test cases and make them very specific to the model, add in specific parameters and test scripts and test benches and so on. Or you may choose to define those lower level test cases that are specific to the model and author those directly inside of Simulink Test. In either case, and we'll look at that second case in a moment where we author the test cases directly in Simulink Test. In either case, once the test cases have come over to from Polarion into Simulink Test, you can choose to update the backlinks. Okay, so what will happen now is if you had modified those test cases that came from Polarion in Simulink Test, we don't modify, when we update the backlinks, we don't modify those original test cases in Polarion. Instead, what we do is we create surrogate test cases for each of those test cases that originated from Polarion. Why do we do that? It's because we feel that we don't want to touch the original test cases that came from Polarion. We'll leave those alone. You've refactored those test cases inside of Simulink Test, and now those refactored test cases are reflected back in Polarion as surrogate test cases. And of course, we'll link them back to the requirements. So if I go, for instance, to the requirements specification, and if I go down to CC 590, now you see that there's two levels, if you like, of test cases it's linked to. There's the high level test cases that were already there to begin with, and then this lower level test case that came from Simulink Test. And you can see various block properties, or not block properties, but parameters that are associated with the Simulink Test case. You can see that it is a test case. And it's linked back to, obviously, the original requirement. And there's also a hyperlink that points back to that test case. So I can go from the surrogate test case back to the test case in Simulink Test as well. All right. So that's kind of how that behavior works. But now let's imagine that instead of this, we author the test cases directly in Simulink Test. So what I'll do is I'll get rid of that old that test file that we just created that originated from Polarion. Instead, what I will do is I will open up a set of test cases that I authored directly in Simulink Test. Now, each of these test cases have been linked to a requirement that originated from Polarion, as you can see here. There's another one. So what I'm going to do right now is, let me just save that. I'm going to update the backlinks for this set of test cases that originated from inside of Simulink Test. So let's click on Update Backlinks. And what the connector will do is it will create surrogate test cases for all of those test cases that were authored in Simulink Test that are linked to requirements that originated from Polarion. So you can see here on the screen that we've now got 6 test cases that were authored directly inside of Simulink Test, and they're automatically linked back to, of course, the Polarion requirements, as you can see here. If I scroll down, perhaps here, you can see again the properties that are associated with this Simulink Test, and of course also there's a hyperlink that navigates me back to, that's the throttle one. Let's just pick another one. Let's pick set speed, for instance. Let's navigate back to that one, and you can see that it navigates back to set speed here. Okay, so that's how that works. The connector works when you author the test cases directly inside of Test Manager. So one thing that we can do now when it comes to test execution and test results is that we can execute the test cases directly from the Polarion connector to Simulink pane. So what this does is it will execute those test cases that I've authored in Simulink Test, and then it will collect the test results from those test cases that have been run back inside of Polarion as test runs. So let's just go ahead and do that now. Click on Execute Test Cases, and we'll see the model, compiling and then running those test cases. So it's going ahead and compiling now. It's starting running. And it's running through the tests one by one. So there were 6 tests, if you remember, that we're going to run. So it's going to run them all. There it goes in purple. So it keeps going through, giving you a percentage. And it's 100% now. And it's come back, and we can see that, in fact, the test case failed. The overall test run failed, I should say. And what's happened is that 5 passed and 1 failed. Okay, so if I select the one that's failed, I can see it's the throttle test. What Polarion has done automatically is raised a defect against that failed test case. So if I select the test case, we can see more information about that, and we can see how it's failed. Let me select it. Let's go ahead and navigate from Polarion to the test case. We can see that the throttle test failed here. So what I can do is I can kind of go ahead and fix that right now. So let me go ahead and do that. Oops. Change that. I'll go back and save the model. And then what I will do is we'll go back to Simulink Test, and I can choose to run that test directly from Simulink Test rather than from the connector pane. You can see now that the throttle test passed after making the update. So what I can do is I can go back to Polarion, and rather than running the test like I just did from the panel, I could just collect the test case result that I just ran directly in Simulink Test and update it back inside of Polarion. So it'll be reflected as a new, of course, it'll be reflected as a new test run in Polarion, but we'll sort of show how that obviously works. So you can see here now that all 6 tests passed, and you can see them all shown here inside of Polarion. So that obviously is all good. For each of the test runs themselves, you can see the various test cases. So if I select the test case, you can obviously scroll down and you can see the test record for that test case, and you can see that it's passed. And of course, we can obviously navigate back to Simulink Test as well. So that's that behavior. There's one final thing I forgot to mention is obviously one thing that's kind of handy is that there's an open test run button. So what it will do is it will automatically open Polarion and pre-select the Simulink Tests template that's used to create these test runs. Because obviously if you have lots of different tests that you're managing inside of Polarion, you obviously just want the Simulink Tests in this case rather than the other tests as well. So anyway, that is a very short demo, or as short as I could make it, showing some of the new functionality of Simulink Test support. Be sure to check out the documentation, because there's lots of things that I didn't have time to mention that are probably useful, so you should definitely consult the documentation. And we look forward to you using this new capability of the Simulink Test support. Thanks very much.